There's a moment in every genius's story that history prefers to forget. Not their breakthrough, not their triumph. The breaking point. The childhood wound so deep, it carved their entire existence around avoiding that pain again. And what emerges from that wound isn't just talent, it's obsession. It's a relentless drive that most people mistake for natural gift when it's actually survival. Because here's what no one tells you about genius. It's not born from comfort. It's forged in the furnace of early trauma. And the same fire that creates a Mozart can just as easily destroy a mind before it ever learns to create. Today, we're diving into the dark psychology of how childhood pain either builds legends or breaks them entirely. And by the end, you'll understand why some of history's greatest minds were also its most tortured souls. But first, let me show you something that will change how you see every genius who ever lived. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just about dead historical figures. It's about the pattern that runs through every extraordinary mind, including ones walking among us today. The ones who seem untouchable, unreachable, almost inhuman in their capabilities. They all share one thing: a childhood that taught them the world wasn't safe unless they were exceptional. Think about it. When you were a child and something went wrong, you had options. You could cry. You could run to safety. You could wait for someone to fix it. But some children, they learn early that no one's coming. That safety isn't guaranteed. That love isn't unconditional. And in that moment of realization, something shifts. The mind doesn't just adapt, it weaponizes itself. This isn't a feel-good story about overcoming adversity. This is about how trauma rewires the brain in ways that create both extraordinary capability and extraordinary suffering. Because the same neural pathways that drive someone to master 17 languages by age 12 are the same ones that make them unable to form normal relationships. The same obsession that leads to revolutionary discoveries also leads to sleepless nights, social isolation, and a mind that never stops running from something that happened decades ago. Let's start with the obvious question. Why does pain create genius? Most people assume it's about motivation. That suffering makes you hungry for success. But that's surface-level thinking. The real answer is neurological. When a child experiences significant trauma or neglect, their developing brain makes a calculation. If I'm not exceptional, I'm not safe. If I don't prove my worth through achievement, I might be abandoned again. So the mind starts optimizing for one thing: being undeniably valuable. It develops hyperfocus. It creates obsessive work patterns. It builds walls around anything that isn't directly related to proving worth through output. The child learns that their existence depends on being irreplaceable. And that desperation, that primal need to survive through excellence, it doesn't fade when they become adults. It intensifies. But here's where it gets complex. Not every traumatized child becomes a genius. Most don't. Because trauma can just as easily shatter a developing mind as sharpen it. The difference lies in something psychologists call cognitive flexibility. Some children, when faced with overwhelming stress, develop tunnel vision so intense it becomes their superpower. Others fragment. They dissociate. They shut down. The same pressure that creates diamonds also creates dust. What determines which path a child takes? It's not what you think. It's not about the severity of the trauma. It's not about family wealth or education. It's about one critical factor: whether the child develops what researchers call an internal locus of control during the crisis. Do they believe, even in their darkest moment, that their actions can influence their outcome? Or do they learn that they're powerless? The future geniuses, they're the ones who, even as children, refuse to accept powerlessness. They might not be able to control their circumstances, but they discover they can control their mind. They can control their focus. They can control their output. And once that pattern locks in, it becomes unstoppable. but it also becomes a prison. Because the same mechanism that drives them to greatness is the same one that makes them incapable of rest, of contentment, of simply being human without constantly proving their worth. Let me give you an example that will make this clear. Picture a 7-year-old child who's learned that love in their household is conditional. Maybe it's based on performance. Maybe it's based on not causing problems. Maybe it's simply absent altogether. That child's brain starts making connections. Safety equals achievement. Love equals being useful. Existence equals proving value. And once those neural pathways are established, they become the operating system for everything that follows. Now fast forward 20 years. That child is now an adult who can't sit still, who can't enjoy a meal without thinking about their next project, who can't form relationships because they're constantly calculating how to be useful to others, who creates magnificent art, groundbreaking science, revolutionary ideas, but can never enjoy any of it because their brain is still running the same program. Achieve or die, prove or perish, create or be forgotten. This is the hidden cost of genius that no biography ever mentions. The inability to exist without producing, the terror of being ordinary, the compulsive need to work because stopping feels like dying. Because for these minds, it literally is. Their childhood taught them that their worth and their survival are the same thing, so they can never stop proving it. But there's another layer to this that's even darker. The childhood trauma doesn't just create the drive for excellence, it also creates the specific type of excellence. The wound shapes the weapon. A child who felt invisible becomes obsessed with being seen through their work. A child who felt powerless becomes obsessed with control and mastery. A child who felt unloved becomes obsessed with creating beauty that will make them lovable. The genius isn't random. It's targeted. It's the mind's attempt to heal a wound that can never fully heal. And here's what makes this tragic. The very thing that makes them extraordinary also ensures they'll never be satisfied by it, because no amount of external achievement can fix an internal conviction formed in childhood. No amount of praise can convince someone whose brain learned at age 6 that they're only valuable when they're producing. No amount of success can silence a voice that whispers, "You're still not enough, you're still not safe, you still haven't done enough to guarantee you won't be abandoned." This creates what I call the genius trap. The more successful they become, the more pressure they feel to maintain that success. Because in their mind, failure doesn't just mean disappointment, it means death. Not literal death, but the death of the only identity that's ever kept them safe. So they push harder. They isolate more. They sacrifice everything human for the altar of achievement. And the world celebrates this sacrifice because it produces things we admire. But we never ask what it costs the person trapped inside that mind. Now you might be thinking, this sounds deterministic. Like childhood trauma either makes you a genius or breaks you, and there's no middle ground. But that's not true, because understanding this pattern is the first step to changing it. The same neuroplasticity that creates these patterns can also rewire them, but only if you first recognize what's really driving the behavior. Only if you understand that behind every obsessive genius is a child who learned that ordinary wasn't safe. The question isn't whether childhood pain creates genius. The evidence is overwhelming that it does. The question is whether we can learn to harness that drive without being consumed by it. Whether we can transform survival-based achievement into something that actually serves the person achieving it. Whether we can keep the superpower while healing the wound that created it. Because here's what I've discovered in studying these patterns. The most transcendent geniuses aren't the ones who never heal their childhood wounds. They're the ones who learn to use their wounds as fuel while no longer being enslaved by them. They keep the drive, the focus, the obsessive dedication. But they stop running from a 7-year-old's terror and start running towards something they actually choose, This transformation doesn't happen accidentally. It requires something most geniuses never develop: the ability to turn their analytical power inward, to study their own patterns with the same ruthless precision they apply to their work. Because the mind that can decode quantum mechanics or compose symphonies that move nations is certainly capable of understanding its own operating system. But it rarely does. Why? Because looking inward means confronting the original wound, and that wound has been buried under decades of achievement, success, and external validation. Most geniuses spend their entire lives running from therapy, from self-reflection, from anything that might slow down their momentum long enough to feel what they've been avoiding. They've built an identity around being too busy, too important, too focused for such things. But this avoidance is just another symptom of the original programming. Because the child who learned that survival depended on constant output grows into an adult who believes stopping to heal means certain death. Here's where it gets interesting. The geniuses who do break this cycle, who do learn to examine their own patterns, they don't lose their edge, they sharpen it. Because now they're not just driven by unconscious compulsion, they're driven by conscious choice. The difference is profound. Unconscious drive feels like being chased. Conscious drive feels like hunting. One is reactive, desperate, never enough. The other is strategic, patient, ultimately more powerful. But this transition requires something that terrifies most high achievers. It requires them to temporarily stop achieving, to create space, to sit with discomfort without immediately converting it into productivity. And for minds that have been running survival programs for decades, this feels like death. Every instinct screams that stopping means disappearing, becoming irrelevant, losing everything they've built. So they don't stop. They can't stop. The machine keeps running until it breaks down completely. This is why so many geniuses flame out spectacularly. Why they have public meltdowns, creative blocks that last years, or simply disappear from their fields entirely. The system that created their success eventually consumes them, because no human being can sustain that level of internal pressure indefinitely. The mind that learned to weaponize itself in childhood eventually turns those weapons inward. And here's what's truly tragic. By the time most people recognize these patterns, they're so entrenched that change feels impossible. They've built entire careers, relationships, identities around being the person who never stops, never slows down, never shows weakness. The idea of being ordinary, even temporarily, feels like erasing themselves entirely. So they choose the familiar suffering of endless achievement over the unknown territory of healing. But some don't. Some reach a breaking point where continuing the pattern becomes more painful than changing it, where the cost of being driven finally exceeds the terror of slowing down. And when that happens, when a genius finally turns their formidable intelligence toward understanding themselves, the results can be extraordinary. Not just in terms of personal healing, but in terms of what they create next. Because work that emerges from conscious choice, rather than unconscious compulsion, has a different quality. It's not desperate. It's not trying to prove anything. It's not running from anything. It simply is, and paradoxically, this work often becomes their most powerful, most lasting contribution, because it comes from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from strength rather than survival. The shift happens gradually. First, they start noticing their patterns without judgment, the way they can't sit still during conversations, the way they feel physically ill when they're not producing something, the way they measure their worth by their output. They begin to see these behaviors not as personality traits, but as outdated survival strategies. Then they start experimenting with small changes. Maybe they take a walk without listening to a podcast. Maybe they eat a meal without checking their phone. Maybe they have a conversation that isn't about work. Each experiment teaches them something crucial. that they can exist without constantly proving their existence, that their value isn't dependent on their productivity, that they are more than their achievements. This doesn't happen quickly. For minds that have been optimized for decades around a specific set of survival strategies, rewiring takes time. There are setbacks, moments of panic when the old programming kicks in and screams that they're wasting time, becoming lazy, losing their edge. But gradually, a new understanding emerges. They realize they can keep their drive while changing what drives them. The external world often resists this transformation. Colleagues, family members, entire industries have become dependent on their compulsive productivity. When a genius starts setting boundaries, saying no, prioritizing their well-being, people panic. They're told they're losing their passion, their edge, their spark. But what's really happening is they're losing their desperation. And desperation, while it can fuel short-term achievement, is ultimately unsustainable and destructive. What emerges in its place is something rarer and more powerful: sustainable excellence. Work that comes from choice rather than compulsion. Achievement that enhances rather than depletes. Success that includes rather than excludes the person achieving it. This isn't about becoming less ambitious or less capable. It's about becoming more human while retaining everything that made them exceptional. The pattern becomes clear when you study the geniuses who made this transition successfully. They don't work less, they work differently, with more focus, more intention, more strategic thinking, because they're no longer wasting energy running from childhood ghosts. They're channeling that same intensity toward goals they've consciously chosen, rather than unconsciously inherited. And here's what's remarkable. Their work often becomes more innovative, more breakthrough, more influential, because creativity flourishes in psychological safety. When the mind isn't constantly scanning for threats, constantly calculating survival odds, it can access deeper levels of insight and connection. The same neural resources that were tied up in hypervigilance become available for genuine discovery. This is the secret that no one talks about. The geniuses we admire most, the ones whose work transcends their time and touches something universal, they're not the ones still running from childhood wounds. They're the ones who learned to transform those wounds into wisdom, who kept the gifts while healing the trauma that originally created them. But here's what most people miss about this transformation. It doesn't happen through gentle self-help or positive thinking. It happens through the same ruthless precision that created their genius in the first place. They apply their analytical brilliance to dissecting their own patterns. They study their triggers with scientific rigor. They experiment with their responses like they're solving equations. The same mind that mastered complex systems finally turns its attention to the most complex system of all, itself. And when that happens, something profound shifts. The energy that was once scattered across desperate proving becomes concentrated into deliberate creation. The focus that was once fragmented by unconscious fear becomes laser sharp through conscious choice. They don't lose their intensity. They refine it. They don't abandon their obsession. They redirect it towards something that actually serves them rather than enslaving them. This is where the story gets interesting, because the world is full of broken geniuses who never made this leap. Brilliant minds that burned out before they could transform their wounds into wisdom. We celebrate their early work while ignoring the human cost. We build myths around their tortured genius while missing the deeper truth. Their suffering wasn't necessary for their greatness. It was just the price they paid for never learning to separate their worth from their output. Think about the ones who died young, the ones who flamed out publicly, the ones who disappeared into addiction or madness. Their talent was real. Their contributions were genuine. But they never learned that the mechanism that created their genius could also destroy them if left unchecked. They rode the survival program all the way to its inevitable conclusion: complete burnout or self-destruction. But the ones who survive, who thrive, who create work that outlasts their lifetimes, They all share one characteristic. At some point, they stopped running from their childhood and started using it as fuel for something larger than mere survival. They transformed their wound from a weakness into a weapon. Not a weapon against the world, but a weapon for creating something meaningful within it. Here's the brutal truth that no one wants to acknowledge. Your childhood pain didn't create your genius to make you special. It created your genius to keep you alive. And once you understand that distinction, everything changes. Because now you can choose what to do with the gifts that trauma accidentally gave you. You can keep using them for survival, or you can start using them for something that actually matters to you. The question isn't whether you were shaped by childhood wounds. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in these patterns, you were. The question is what you're going to do with that shaping. Are you going to spend the rest of your life running from a 7-year-old's terror? Or are you going to finally turn around, acknowledge that child, and then consciously choose what comes next? Because here's what I've learned from studying these patterns across history. The most powerful transformation isn't when someone overcomes their childhood trauma. It's when they integrate it, when they keep the gifts while healing the wounds, when they honor what that trauma taught them about focus and dedication, while refusing to let it dictate their entire existence. This integration doesn't diminish their capabilities, it amplifies them. Because now they're not just driven by what they're running from, they're pulled toward what they're creating for. And that shift, from running to choosing, from surviving to thriving, from proving to expressing, that's where true genius lives. Not in the wound itself, but in what the person consciously decides to build from the materials that wound provided. The childhood pain didn't forge genius. It forged survival mechanisms that happened to look like genius to the outside world. But real genius, sustainable genius, transcendent genius, that only emerges when someone finally stops surviving and starts living. When they keep the intensity, but change the intention. When they transform their greatest vulnerability into their greatest strength, not by accident, but by choice. And that choice, that conscious decision to use your wounds as fuel rather than being consumed by them, that's available to anyone who recognizes these patterns in themselves. The same mind that can create extraordinary things can also recreate itself. The same focus that built empires can also build peace. The same obsession that changed the world can also heal the person who carries it. The geniuses who figured this out didn't become less brilliant. They became more human. And in becoming more human, their work became more universal, more lasting, more truly transformative, because it no longer came from a place of desperate proving. It came from a place of deliberate giving. And that gift, born from healed wounds rather than open ones, that's what echoes through eternity. Your childhood pain was never the point. It was just the catalyst. What you choose to do with what it created, that's where your real power lies. And that choice is always available, no matter how long you've been running, no matter how successful the survival program has made you appear. The question isn't whether you can change these patterns. The question is whether you're finally ready to stop being driven by them and start driving them instead. That's the real secret of genius. Not the wound that created it, but the wisdom that transforms it. Not the pain that forged it, but the choice that refines it. And once you understand that, you realize the most extraordinary thing of all. Your greatest achievements might still be ahead of you, waiting on the other side of finally making peace with the child who started this whole extraordinary, exhausting, magnificent journey.